Hi, everyone. So it's time to begin. It's 2:05 p.m. Eastern Time, and we're ready to start. I'm sure there's going to be some people trickling in later too. But first, we want to welcome you to our webinar, Controversies of the Elevated Plus Maze. Thank you so much for attending. You might think, well, why did we decide to go with the Elevated Plus Maze? Um, well, BehaviorCloud is our company that provides tools to human and animal researchers who study behavior. We specifically offer a cloud platform that provides everything you need to collect, analyze, and share your behavioral data. And during the course of the last year or so, we've seen rises in studies involving anxiety, depression, specifically traumatic brain injury, PTSD, that kind of thing. So we wanted to host a webinar that would help animal researchers who are either entering behavioral research, maybe they've never used this test before, or maybe they've never even done a behavioral test before. And we also wanted to help people who are currently using it and want to know how to optimize their current setup. We'll be recording this webinar, so please feel free to take notes or just listen, and we'll send you this video later today. So a little bit about us. You can see us there in those pictures. My name is Chloe, and I'm your account manager here at BehaviorCloud. You can feel free to contact me with questions during or after the webinar. I have a background in neuroscience as a researcher at Walter Reed, studying blast traumatic brain injury, where we use the Elevated Plus Maze to evaluate our model. And I've also helped hundreds of researchers optimize their behavioral lab through consulting, training, and support. And my colleague Tracy is joining us today. She's the co-founder of BehaviorCloud and offers a wealth of animal behavior expertise, particularly in mood disorders. She has studied and published multiple papers, peer-reviewed articles, and book chapters during her PhD at Ohio State University and her postdoc at the Salk Institute, involving many behavioral tests, including the Elevated Plus Maze. So let's take a minute to see where everyone is from. Could you all, at the bottom of your Zoom display, click on the chat box icon? If you click this, you will see a coinciding chat pop-up window. Could you please write in there and say where you're from? So we've got someone from University of Toronto. I hope it's not cold there anymore. Oh, University of Alabama. Anyone else? UCLA. I wish I was in California right now. Got University of Puerto Rico School of Medicine. Sounds like we have a bunch of people from a lot of cool places. So I just want to let you know that during the course of this webinar, please feel free to utilize the chat box to ask us any questions, and we'll do our best to answer all the questions, either in the chat window or as we're going through the presentation. So we'd like to start this webinar with a poll. So I'm going to launch it right now. So just take a minute to briefly answer these questions, and then we will share the results. So we've got 2 more people that need to answer the poll. Let's just take a few more seconds here. Okay. Well, we've got some people studying mice and rat models. Everyone here is currently doing behavioral tests in their lab, and everyone is using the Elevated Plus maze, and everyone is currently using animal tracking software. Well, we're gonna be here today to tell you more about the Elevated Plus maze, how you can optimize your current setup, and maybe you can also try using BehaviorCloud in the future. So let's get started with the presentation. Tracy, do you want to take the lead?
Sure, yeah. So we wanted to start with just a real brief basic background to make sure everybody is on the same page. So the Elevated Plus maze was first developed by Handley and Mahoney in the 1980s, and it was developed as a rodent test for anxiety-like responses. Since then, it's been used very widely to study things like anxiolytic and anxiogenic compounds, as well as the effects of different environmental experiences like stressors. The test is based on the rodents' natural aversion to open spaces and their tendency to be thigmotaxic, which just means they have a preference to hug the walls or stay in enclosed spaces. So the Elevated Plus maze has 2 enclosed arms and 2 open arms, and the open arms are aversive. Typically, this test is run on videotape, so a camera is mounted above the maze, and then the animal's activity is videotaped and then later on analyzed. Variables that are looked for are things like time spent in the open versus closed arms, the number of entries that the animal makes to the open arms, and the latency for them to first enter the open arms. And so this can be analyzed with automatic video tracking software, or it can be manually hand scored by a human observer. So today we're talking about controversies of the Elevated Plus maze, or in other words, areas where there's poor standardization across labs and researchers tend to have different opinions on how things should be done. We're going to go beyond the opinions today, and we're going to see what the data actually say about how testing environment, running the maze, and some other things can affect your overall results. All right, so we're going to start off with looking at how the testing environment affects your data. Specifically, we're going to talk about ambient light and noise in the testing room, the presence of other subjects, and the presence of the investigator himself. So first off, we're going to do a quick poll here. Before we discuss this data, let's see how you do things in your lab. So if you've run the Elevated Plus maze before, which it seems like most everyone has, let us know in the pop-up poll on your screen whether you run your subjects with the lights on or lights off, or don't really pay any attention to that. And we'll let you know the results in a few minutes after we discuss this. All right, so while we're waiting on the results, let's talk about how light and noise affect your data. Ambient lighting in the testing room can be a point of controversy. Some people run their testing with lights on, some with lights off. Other people do it under dim light or even in the dark with red light. There's no true right answer here for how to do it because there's considerations about your specific experiment to take into account. But many studies have looked at the effect of lighting on behavior in the Elevated Plus maze, and they show that ambient light has a profound effect on behavior. So it's definitely something to consider. When you're testing in low light, rodents are much more likely to explore the open arms, whereas in bright light, they're less likely. So bright light really contributes to the aversiveness of the open arms. You can take advantage of this knowledge depending on the goal of your study, as long as you apply it consistently to all of the subjects, of course. So if you're testing for an anxiogenic effect and you're expecting to measure an increase in open arm time, you might want to use low light to encourage more open arm exploration among your subjects, and vice versa. Now, as far as noise in the testing room, rodents are very sensitive to this, and their behavior can be easily influenced, both by noises coming from outside of the testing room as well as within. For example, someone might slam a door in the next room, and then your subject freezes on the open arm, which artificially inflates open arm time for that subject, It invalidates your trial. We don't want that. So to minimize this, it can be really helpful to use a fan or something similar to create white noise in the test room. So bottom line here, be consistent with your lighting, be mindful that light and noise can both affect your experiments. And with that, I think our poll results are probably in.
Okay. Yep, so everyone said lights on versus one person saying lights off. Do you also suggest that maybe people put like signs on their doors, maybe, you know, just prevent like interruptions or things like that? Or
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's always good to kind of put up a sign in the hallway outside of your room and say, you know, anyone walking around out here, just be mindful that there's testing going on, keep the noise down.
Mhm.
Don't open the testing door while, you know, somebody's running a trial in there.
Yeah. And how, you said, like, how dark is too dark, do you think? Because I know people have sent me videos before where it's basically pitch black. I don't know if you could shed some light on like how dark is too dark, or like what's the difference between like dark light and red light.
Yeah, there's some different considerations that go in there. So if you're using video tracking software, there's usually you know, some minimal level of light that's going to be necessary to pick up the subject against the background of the maze. With our software, usually, you know, it's actually not too much light. It's pretty minimal. I've seen people that can use an infrared light source and still get pretty good tracking of their subject. You know, the other consideration here is just, you know, what experiment you're running. So if you're running an experiment where you're doing elevated plus maze during the night phase, the dark phase for your rodents, you know, you want to keep it pretty dark because you don't want to disrupt their circadian rhythm by turning on all the lights in the middle of the night. So these are some things you just have to kind of consider the specifics of your experiment.
Okay.
All right. So next up, let's talk about how other subjects in the testing room can affect your results. So it's very common for a researcher to wheel a big cart full of cages into the test room and then run their subjects one by one, or even to run multiple mazes side by side in the same room. So, you know, is this really being efficient or is this being wasteful? What do the data say? Well, it turns out that exposure to olfactory cues can be pretty stressful to rodents and therefore alter their behavior. So this graph is from an experiment where pain-related behavior was assessed in mice in parallel with exposure to various odor cues in the testing room. So the bar marked CM is exposure to bedding from cage mates in the room, which did not alter behavior, but you can see that bedding from unfamiliar gonadally intact males of various species all reduced pain behavior because it heightened anxiety in the subjects. And this was not the case with odors from castrated males, suggesting the effect is related to androgens. So this study shows you might want to rethink parking a big cart of cages in your testing room because odor cues from the other animals in the room could cause extra anxiety in your subjects and then affect your downstream data. All right, but another thing here to consider, what about your own presence in the testing room, especially if you're a male? Well, that same study looked at corticosterone levels to measure stress in the mice when they were tested by a male versus a female investigator. Male investigators actually elicited more stress among the mice than females. Even exposure to a t-shirt that was worn by a male investigator did the same, unless it was aired out for 30 minutes or more, which you see in that light purple bar. Exposure to male chemo signals also elicited stress, and the effect was equivalent to a restraint stress exposure, which is a very strong stressor for mice. So as you might expect, this stress translated into a change in behavior in the open field test, which is shown here in the graph below. So bottom line here, be aware that you can affect the behavior of your subjects just by your presence in the room. So always randomize subjects really well, especially if different investigators are collecting data for the same experiment. And if possible, sit just outside the room during a trial. BehaviorCloud actually makes it really easy to start, stop, and observe your trials remotely just with a mobile device, so you can stay out of the room and out of the way.
So Tracy, you brought up some really good points about odor. So I know a lot of people have both mouse and rat, and they showed that in the polls, the poll results. So do you recommend that people have their elevated plus maze for like the mouse and the rat in separate rooms, or like the same rooms? Can they use the same maze for both models, or what do you think?
I think you can use the same room as long as you don't have like a lot of other animals in there at the same time when you're running a subject. But generally, you have two different elevated plus mazes: a larger one for rats and a smaller size one for mice. It just fits better with the different body sizes of those animals.
Okay. And do you recommend like habituating those animals to the room like prior to actually starting the experiment, or can I just start like as soon as I put my cart outside of the room?
Oh, that's a great point. So it's good to always habituate your animals to the room, just because there's some novelty there, just by being taken into a new room, a new area outside of the housing facility. So it's good to bring in your animals about 30 minutes before testing to wherever you're going to be, having them, and let them get used to that space.
Okay.
All right, I'll let you take the next section here.
Thanks, Tracy. So now we're going to talk about the important variable to consider when running the maze, specifically the starting position, the trial length, and unfortunate events. But first, we're going to do another poll. So please tell us in the pop-up poll window on your screen how to start your subjects in the elevated plus maze. Is it in the center square, facing the open arm, or facing a closed arm? Or maybe you place it in the middle of one of the arms. We'll share the results in a few minutes after I describe what you should do. So just take a second here to answer the questions. There we go. Okay, so the starting position in the elevated plus maze is another controversy. Some investigators will put the mice or rats in the closed arm, but most agree that starting out in the center square is best because it's a neutral location and the rodent can choose which arm to enter first. But what's more controversial is whether you should start them facing a certain direction, or maybe you switch it up every trial. Well, the data is pretty clear in this case that rodents started facing the open arm have a 50% chance of going into the open arm first, whereas they only have a 20% chance if they started facing the closed arm. When rodents are first placed into the maze, they tend to lurch forward away from the investigator, and if they are facing an open arm, they just happen to run in the direction of the open arm. The same happens when you place them facing the closed arm. They just tend to run into the closed arm and they don't really venture out into the open arms. So the bottom line here is that you have to make sure that you're consistent about which direction you are starting a subject, start your subjects facing the same direction, and make sure you continue doing that throughout all of your trials. And make sure that you're gentle and not just flinging them in front of the maze. I know we had a couple of people doing that in our lab before. So let's see what the poll results say. So it says that most of you place the animal in the center facing the open arms, and then the others also said facing the closed arms. So it doesn't really matter. It most preferentially from Wolf and Fry and many of the other people that actually write the method for the elevated plus maze do recommend that you start your animals facing the open arms, because if you do face them towards the closed arms, they do tend to actually stay in the closed arms and do not venture out. Okay, so trial length. So this is another area of confusion. Many researchers do something between a 5 and 10 minute trial, but you'll find in the papers that there's no real standardization. In this case, the data show that The rodents explore equally each part of the maze at first, and then the closed arm tendency emerges after the first 2 minutes of the exposure to the maze. After that, the tendency to prefer the closed arms becomes more pronounced. On second exposure to the maze, the effect is already there during the first minutes. So what does this mean for you as an investigator? A trial must be at least 3 minutes, and depending on your expected effect size, you may want to run a longer trial. Analyzing your data in time bins, which is what is shown here, is easy to do with our software at BehaviorCloud, and it will give you a more complete picture of how your effect changes over the course of the trial. So just keep that in mind when you're running your tests in the future. Also, we have another question here. It's from AFB. It says, what is your opinion about tail pickup versus using the cup method to place the mice in the center of the elevated plus maze? I mean, I guess from my experience, I've always used the tail pickup. What about you, Tracy?
I have used the tail method, although, I was reading a paper recently that said the cup method is actually better because it keeps the animal calmer, and they're less likely to kind of like just lurch away from you and go running into one direction without thinking about it. So that might actually be the way
putting them in a cup, or is that like holding them and putting them down?
You can use like an actual cup or even like a tube or something like plastic, and then that way, you don't have to like handle them too much. Although that is another point that we're going to talk about as we go forward, handling of the mouse.
Okay. And then also, we're going to talk about unfortunate events. Now, there's always the risk of this happening during a trial. One example is when a rodent falls off on the open arm. We've all been there. You think that it ruins your experiment, but it doesn't. Maybe your lab mate runs into the room, doesn't see the sign on the door, and you think, what do you do? Well, we always recommend discarding this trial from your data set, but you do want to actually place the animal back onto the elevated plus maze so that it can kind of get the same experience as all the other animals that have gone through the trial. So just make sure that it goes through the allotted time. Say it falls off in minute 3, you want to like at least keep it for another 2 minutes or however long you're running the test. This is important because if you plan to do a battery of behavioral tests, you just want to have each animal go through the same experience as all the other animals. This is the bottom line for most of these points. We just want to have consistency.
I actually had a mentor, Chloe, who said that if you sneezed in the middle of a trial, you should technically sneeze for all the subsequent trials as well. But that's probably taking it a bit far. All right, so in our final section, we'll talk about other considerations to think about when you're doing elevated plus maze testing. So we're going to talk about time of day effects, prior handling of your subjects, repeated testing, and how to interpret that elusive center zone. One more poll for you. So we'd like to ask, do you test your mice during the light or day phase or the dark or night phase? And we'll show these results to you in a few minutes. All right, so as you all know, rodents are mostly nocturnal, which means they're most active during the nighttime and they sleep during the day. Of course, this affects other aspects of their behavior as well, like memory and cognition. That's to say, would you ace an exam at 3 a.m.? Probably not. So studies like this one we're showing here clearly show that even anxiety behavior is affected by the time of day. Rodents tend to explore the open arms more readily during the dark phase, meaning their nighttime, when they're awake and active. And during their sleep time, they exhibit higher anxiety. So this means you've got to be conscious of this fact when you're running an elevated plus maze. You need to know what time is lights on and lights off in your animal housing facility, and never let a testing session spill over between the light and dark phase. In fact, if you're running a large cohort of subjects, you'd really do better to split your testing over a couple of days, run during the same general time window, rather than do a marathon 8-hour testing session. Because as you can see here, the behavior changes with time. Always randomize your testing order of your subjects. BehaviorCloud actually timestamps all of your data, so it's really easy to correlate your results to the testing time after the fact, and just make sure that time of day did not affect your result. Now let's see with the poll results. It looks like everybody tests during the light phase. So now just keep in mind when you're doing that, you know, to keep your testing within kind of a discrete, maybe 4-hour or so window, and not go too crazy testing all day long, because the behavior could change over time.
So Tracy, just before we start this next slide, someone else asked a private question about when we mentioned to discard the data if the mouse falls off of the elevated plus maze. What if 80% of the mice do this? Do we discard all of that data, or what other recommendations can we do to prevent them from doing that?
So I experienced this firsthand. In my PhD work, we were working with a wild-caught species of mice, Paramyscus leucopus, and those mice are kind of crazy compared to the inbred lab mice, and they would just go flying off the elevated plus maze like constantly. They were like popcorn, jumping up and down. So what we did is we kind of had to adapt to a different anxiety measure in that case. We switched to using the open field test because it kept them contained. You know, if 80% of your mice are falling off, you might want to consider open field or maybe light dark box. There are some other options that could measure a similar variable without, you know, having them falling off all the time.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good.
All right, so another thing we're going to talk about is prior handling of your subjects. So some investigators like to handle their rodents for a few days before testing, just to habituate them to humans and make the testing less stressful. Other people don't do this at all. So, you know, for some tests, this might work, but this particular study we found showed that prior handling actually eliminated the effect of an anti-anxiety drug in the elevated plus maze, thus reducing the sensitivity of this test. So for elevated plus maze at least, you know, you might want to consider that if you need to run a battery of behavioral tests, maybe start with elevated plus maze first so the mice haven't had too much excessive handling, if that's your most critical test in your battery. Otherwise, just be very consistent with how you handle all of your subjects across groups so that this variable doesn't affect your data. All right, another thing to think about is repeated testing. So sometimes you want to measure anxiety behavior in the same set of subjects at different points over the course of an experiment. And you'll see this done sometimes, but it's really important to consider that the elevated plus maze is subject to something called one trial tolerance. That means many studies have shown that open arm exploration decreases markedly upon re-exposure to the elevated plus maze, even when mice are treated with anti-anxiety drugs, and this effect lasts for about a month. So that makes it difficult to interpret data that's derived from a recent repeat exposure. So keep this in mind for your studies, and if you need to get a second anxiety measure within about 4 weeks of the first elevated plus maze exposure, you can try using a different but analogous test, like some of the ones I mentioned, open field, or there's even an elevated zero maze that you can use.
Hey, Tracy, on that note, what are the differences in the anxiety measured between the elevated plus maze and the open field?
So in the elevated plus maze, you're looking at, you know, time spent in the open arms, entries to the open arms. The open field test is based on a very similar principle where the rodents tend to hug the walls of the chamber, and the center, which is kind of the open exposed area of the field, is really the aversive area. So you'll measure time that's spent in the center square of the open field, latency to enter the center square, It's very similar principle, just slightly different test.
Great.
All right, now for our final controversy, what to do with that pesky center zone. So when you're analyzing elevated plus maze, you'll typically compare time spent in the open arms to the closed arms. But there's always some amount of time spent in the center square, which is sort of a gray area for analysis because it's really considered neutral territory. Generally, we'll recommend excluding time in the center from your analysis, and that's totally acceptable. But we wanted to mention that there are versions of this test, like the elevated zero maze, that actually eliminate this whole confusion completely by having no center zone at all. So it's a circular elevated platform where part of it is enclosed with walls, like the closed arms on the elevated plus maze, and part of it is open. And so there's no center zone to worry about at all. Just something to think about.
So other uses. So if you're thinking that the elevated plus maze could only be used for anxiety and depression in the format that we've already shown you, then you're wrong. There's other ways to use it. So another way to use this maze is the discriminative avoidance test. It's a method for testing learning and memory. And as you can see in the picture, one of the closed arms is paired with an inversive stimuli, so like a bright light or a white noise. And then upon second exposure to the maze the next day, you want to measure like how long does the animal spend in the open arms and the other closed arms as well. So it's kind of similar to like the shock box or anything like that, but it's interesting to see that you can actually use this maze for something else. You know, sometimes you go through you know, experiments and you might not necessarily need the elevated plus maze for anxiety, depression, or maybe you have one gathering dust in your lab and you don't really use it anymore. Maybe this is another application for you.
Yeah, I wish I had known about this. I would have definitely done that.
Yeah, at least you can try it out. So you never know. So I just want to let everyone know that we've talked about a lot of things today, and you know, it might be a little bit overwhelming, especially if you're new to behavioral research. We talked about the background of the elevated plus maze, why it's used, how it's used, and improvements to conduct your current setup. So if you'd like further consulting on what tests are best for you in your lab, and to help you with your research, we're happy to help. We can also provide you with the BehaviorCloud software platform and a complete setup for your behavioral suite, including mazes that we mentioned, like the elevated plus maze, elevated zero maze, open field, and more. If you'd like to see a demo or speak to us in more detail, please contact us at the emails written below, hello@behaviorcloud.com, or you can try our free trial at www.behaviorcloud.com. Please send us your email. I think we've gotten everyone's email from this webinar today. We'll be sending this video along with a follow-up survey to our attendees today. This will also include a bibliography of all of the papers we mentioned. And we'll also be posting on all of our social media accounts, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. So please feel free to let us know what topics you want us to cover in the future. This webinar series is kind of like our spring series, and it'd be great to get your feedback and your input for our future events. So thank you again for coming. Please let us know if we can answer any questions in the chat window. We'd be happy to help. And if you have any questions about anything else, we can also answer those. So if it doesn't um, include anything about the Elevated Plus maze, maybe it has something to do with like radial arm maze or something else, you can ask those questions here too. Yeah, we can certainly plan to have a webinar about open field, or we can do different disease models or something like that. So our Behavior Cloud software is actually accessible from the internet, so www.behaviorcloud.com, and you can either live stream with a tablet, iPhone, Android device, um, and live stream it from our platform, or you can actually upload recorded videos, and those are just like the simple video file formats like MP4, MPG. You don't want anything like 4K video or anything too large um, where it won't be able to be uploaded. Does anyone else have any questions? Yeah, thank you all for attending today. We'll send you the email again later today with the video, the bibliography, the survey. So please, 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 please fill that out tonight or tomorrow, whenever you have time, just so that we can get your feedback and your input on this webinar and for help making our future webinars. Okay, if no one else has any other questions, I'm going to end the webinar in 2 minutes at 2:45. So get your questions in quickly. Okay, just wondering if you, yes, so we can send you the link to the study where it showed a decrease in open arm exploration. It'll be in the PowerPoint presentation that we send along with the email. It'll be located in the bibliography. Um,